Once again, for anyone who's joining early, we're going to get started here at about 11. So in about 2 minutes, we'll kick it off. Just waiting one more minute. All right, so it's 11. So hi, everyone, and thank you for joining the Cyberspace Solarium Commission for this digital event. Today's topic is on our pillar of recommendations titled Reshaping the Cyber Ecosystem. I want to remind everyone in the audience to please use the Q&A function in the bottom right corner of your screens, and our panelists will use that to answer their questions during the Q&A portion. This event will be recorded and will be made available on our website at www.solarium.gov later on in the day. So without further ado, Mark, why don't you go ahead and kick us off?
Hey, thanks, Diane, and good afternoon or good morning, everybody. I'm Bart Montgomery, the Executive Director of the CSC. Welcome to the fourth in these CSC Digital Discussion Series. Sorry we moved to a Thursday for one day, but we'll get back on Wednesdays. In these events, I try to get the senior staff to spend about an hour diving into the details of and answering questions about a specific topic area from the Commission's report. If you missed it 3 weeks ago, we started with layered cyber deterrence, the Commission's recommended strategy. Last week, we did the Commission's recommendations on reforming the U.S. government. Today, we're going to discuss the recommendations to reshape the cyber ecosystem towards greater security. And one of the key findings in the report was the need to establish a better deterrence by denial capability. And that deterrence by denial being one of the three elements of deterrence we brought into layered cyber deterrence. But we really felt that deterrence by denial is where the big investments were needed. And key to that was a more effective and robust defense of our critical infrastructure against the malicious cyber actions. And that requires reshaping the cyber ecosystem. This pillar mixes ideas that advocate good governance at both the state and federal levels with responsible private sector behavior and proper cyber hygiene across all levels, from the government to businesses to individuals. And while we aim for market forces to drive participation and engagement, there is a mix of incentives and regulation to spur the market embedded in these recommendations. We understand these will be some of the hardest legislative proposals to pass through Congress, but they would also give the most far-reaching effects. Okay, so that's my introduction. Enough for me. I'm going to transition to the real experts. Three people we've seen before: Corey Simpson, our Senior Director and Lead of the Integration Cell; John Costello, the Senior Director and Leader for Task Force 2; and Rob Morgus, the Director of Research and Analysis. So for the remainder of the hour, I'm going to ask them some questions, 5 or 6. That'll give you time to add into the Q&A function here in WebEx, and then I'll start reading your questions out to them. And the last couple of times the questions have been right on mark, and I get through about 80% of them. So first, I'll start with, and the idea behind these questions is just kind of flesh out how we reached some of the more important, key recommendations. So I'll start with John Costello. John, our first recommendation for this pillar discussed the creation of a national cybersecurity certification and labeling authority. Can you explain how this would work practically and the logic behind the recommendation?
Unmute there, John.
Yeah, certainly, and thanks, Mark. I think it's important first to comment on the view commissioners had on regulation versus market incentives. I think commissioners recognize that, especially in technology and information technology, that the market moves very fast, the market changes very fast, and the market, while it's been good to provide innovation, it hasn't been great on delivering on security. Now, we know that this could be changing. Customers are demanding more from their information technology products when it comes to security. And you're starting to see some producers respond to that a little bit. But I think the central question, that the central gap commissioners are trying to address, and I think it's addressed by National Cybersecurity Certification and Labeling Authority, is how to create a transparency in the market so that consumers can choose security if they want to, and vote with their money, as it were, and how to get to a place where producers can demonstrate security to differentiate themselves based on that. It's a little bit of a chicken and egg thing, you know. To move the market, you need consumers to demand more, and you need producers to see that as a way to make money and differentiate themselves. So creating some market transparency here is a good idea. And the way we thought about doing that is looking at how do we get product device manufacturers and software developers to be able to test or certify to common industry best practices or common industry security standards. And so, I mean, I think the touch point going into this was how do we get to secure to market instead of first to market? Obviously, they're not always they don't always run contrary, but even when they do, like, how can we ensure that the most secure products possible can get to market and consumers can vote there? As far as the National Cybersecurity Certification and Labeling Authority, how we see this working is it is inspired by a lot of existing efforts that have been led by nonprofits, for-profits, and people that before. I think Mudge has had something similar in the past few years. And the gap that we've seen is really authority and consistent funding over time. So the way we sort of crafted this is the Department of Commerce and Department of Homeland Security would competitively select from existing nonprofit efforts to designate them as a national and fund them as a national cybersecurity certification and labeling authority. This authority would be empowered to create certifications based on existing standards and work with NIST to do so, and to develop new ones if it's necessary for classes of products. They'd also be able to designate other nonprofits or other efforts or research institutions as certifying agents around specific classes of technology to create and certify products within a certain class. So, for instance, it could be consumer routers, it could be cloud services, it could be phones, it could be a certain type of software, and they could structure their work that way. So we see this, we see that it being managed this way. We also ask them to develop a objective measuring device, objective device for the measurement of security in a given product. I know there's a number of different products and services out there that can do that, and we ask them to create a regime that could do that objectively. And we ask all of this to be publicly posted. So, say you're going to buy a router at home. Or you're a procurement authority in a critical infrastructure company, and you're looking at a router specific device that you want to acquire, you can look at a retailer or a vendor and see what they're certified to. But you could also double check that against a publicly available list that the National Cybersecurity Certification and Labeling Authority would maintain, and you can make your decisions that way. and understand your risk a little bit better when you're buying and acquiring products. And lastly, I mean, I think this is also important. While we don't prescribe regulation here, we do empower the FTC to bring cases against companies that have falsely attested to a certification. So say they do certify, say they do attest to a certification and it's found out later that they haven't honored that and they're not doing that in good faith. It is important that that has consequences. So I think that really captures the NICLA recommendation. I think this is a cornerstone one for the ecosystem in trying to nudge the market forward using market forces. And I think it's I think one of our most foundational recommendations in general. Back to you, Mark.
Hey, thanks, John. So Rob, picking up on that, if that's what will be produced by this non-government organization or however the authority is established in the end, what responsibilities would vendors then have in ensuring that they prioritize security of their products?
Thanks, Mark. So it's a good question. I'm going to get to it here in a second, but I want to just take a quick step back and talk a little bit at a high level about the ecosystem pillar and sort of the motivation behind that before we dive in, because I think it's instructive in sort of the rest of the conversation today. And I would just say part and parcel of defensive investment, which Mark talked about as a sort of key piece of our strategy, is shaping the cyber ecosystem towards security. And the general philosophy there is that where resilience sort of drives down the consequence of successful attacks, and better public-private collaboration and operationalizing better public-private collaboration can enable us to go after sort of threat actors and diminish the threat landscape. Improving the security of the cyber ecosystem is all about driving down vulnerability, and that comes in a number of different forms. It comes in the form of improving the human behavior and the organizational behavior of groups and individuals that plug into the ecosystem. It includes sort of empowering ICT enablers, which we'll talk about in a little bit. It means ensuring trusted suppliers, which again we'll talk about. And then I think Corey's going to hit on the promotion of systemic data security. It means all of those things. It also means improving or diminishing the vulnerability of the technology that we plug into the ecosystem or that constitutes the ecosystem. John talked about the labeling authority, the certification and labeling authority, which is one sort of angle of attack by the commission in order to drive down vulnerability. And that's sort of really about creating transparency in the market and allowing folks to use the power of the purse to really demand greater security from the vendors. We also have a second recommendation that I think is pretty closely related, and this one revolves around what we call final goods assemblers and clarifying the duty of care and the liability that final goods assemblers hold for the products and services that they produce. So those of you who've been around cybersecurity policy for more than a couple of years will likely be familiar with the longstanding conversation around software vendor liability. This is basically the Commission's input or take on this issue. Our contention, and I think this is borne out by recent FTC action, is that software and hardware vendors, what we refer to as final goods assemblers in the recommendation, may already be liable for damages caused by the products they sell. What's missing is a clearly codified and established duty of care. This recommendation seeks to clarify that duty of care and the potential liability product vendors or final goods assemblers hold. The liability we propose revolves around the concept of a known vulnerability, which we define in the recommendation as vulnerabilities publicly disclosed through national vulnerability databases or that are assigned a CVE number, vulnerabilities reported to the software or hardware vendor by a third party, and vulnerabilities that have been discovered by the software or hardware vendor itself, the final goods assembler. At the end of the day, we envision final goods assemblers as those most responsible for putting the product into the stream of commerce. There's one final goods assembler per product. And in drafting legislation, we've been careful to carve out or put in a carve out that basically diminishes the potential that this could cause massive harm in the open source community. We're very cognizant of that being an issue here. What we ultimately envision, though, is a federal private right of action. So a private right of action in a federal court against final goods assemblers for victims of cyber incidents that leverage known vulnerabilities for which the final goods assembler has not already made a patch. And the idea here is that final goods assemblers, which is generally speaking sort of those hardware and software vendors, will be able to take a look at their product and say, okay, we think that there's a very small likelihood that this vulnerability will be exploited and cause damages up to a certain threshold. We're therefore okay with keeping that vulnerability in, not sort of prioritizing patching that. But hey, here's another one that we've discovered. It's publicly known at this point, and we think there's sort of a bit of urgency here, and we could actually see damages incurred by people who use this product. Hey, we need to expedite our patching process for that one. And the idea is really to improve that patching process on the vendor side. It's then still up to the end user to put that patch in, and if a patch is made available, the final goods assembler has met the duty of care and would not be liable for a suit. I see Dave just popped up in the question and answer. I'm going to just address that one right now. No. So the idea is that distributors would not be liable. It would be the actual the sort of person or the group that built the product itself. With that, Mark, I'll hand it back over to you.
All right, thanks. Well, Rob, I'm going to stick with you because the next one's one of the issues. Well, both you and John pushed hard, but the commission report made clear that the U.S. government and general public lack the clarity of nature and scope of cyber attacks. In other words, we don't have all the data we need. I think we're in the middle of experiencing something where data is king, in the pandemic. So as it happened, with some foresight, you all recommended the creation of a Bureau of Cyber Statistics. Can you explain the importance of this and the role you see a Bureau of Cyber Statistics playing over in the security of the ecosystem?
Absolutely. So yeah, as you mentioned, the BCS is a critical recommendation in the ecosystem pillar, and it's geared pretty squarely at improving the behavior in the ecosystem. We'll get into sort of how we see this being operationalized in a little bit, but for now, I would say, today as a nation, as you mentioned, Mark, and that includes policy and decision makers in the public and private sectors, in and out of government, as well as researchers, we lack the necessary data on which, on the threat we're facing, the ways that we can mitigate, the best sort of actions to buy down or drive down risk and vulnerability. And we sort of just lack an empirical understanding of what does and doesn't work to prevent or stop this sort of onslaught that we're seeing right now. Just like we have statistical bureaus and other arcane areas to inform policy and decision makers, think the Bureau of Economic Analysis or the Bureau of Labor Statistics or Bureau of Justice Statistics, the Bureau of Cyber Statistics would be crucial for informing decisions in and out of government. Let's start with where it would get data. We see the Bureau collecting and aggregating open source data, purchasing private or proprietary data repositories from folks who are collecting relevant data on the cyber ecosystem, cybercrime, et cetera, and conducting surveys. Departments and agencies would also assist the Bureau in its work, making data available as necessary and as needed. In terms of what the Bureau would do, in broad strokes, it would conduct statistical analysis on trends in cybersecurity, working to derive insights into, for example, which controls recommended through the NIST framework are most effective and in what circumstances for preventing cyber attacks. The Bureau would publish findings and make data available to the broader research community. And in an effort to bring in additional analytical talent and get more of the Bureau's work out into the broader cybersecurity community, we also envision and recommend the creation of an exchange program whereby academics and folks from the private sector, say the insurance industry, for example, would be able to come in, work with the Bureau's data in the Bureau setting, sort of collaborate, and then go back out and take their learnings and the new understandings and push them out into the community. Back over to you, Mark.
Thanks. Got it. Kicking back to John now. You discussed the National Cybersecurity Certification and Labeling Authority. Why did the report single out cloud security in this context as one area in need of certification? And what, if any, lessons are there to be learned from the uptake of cloud services amidst this COVID-19 pandemic?
That's a good question, Mark. So cloud services, well, one thing that we recognize, I think, pretty early on in the commission's work, the commissioners recognize that cloud is can be a worthwhile investment for a lot of companies, especially small and medium-sized businesses, where a small cost to transition for some of their services, especially commodity services like email, et cetera, can reduce costs in the long run and provide greater security. A cloud service provider or a managed service provider that offers similar services should be in a better place to be able to handle security for their clients and often than the clients themselves. Now, granted, this isn't a panacea. We know this. A lot of this depends upon a clear understanding from the client and recipient of cloud services how they can mitigate the risk and their steps they need to take to make sure they secure their use of the cloud services themselves. That said, but one thing, so I mean that really gets us to one of the recommendations we have on cloud, which is how can the government incentivize the uptake for state, local, tribal, and territorial governments, and for small and medium-sized businesses, and we asked the government to study that issue. But that prompts I think the second recommendation on a cloud security certification, which is now we know that if more and more businesses are going to the cloud, that centralizes risk under the cloud service providers. So the question is how can we make sure the cloud service providers are managing that risk and securing their services effectively? I think for a lot of the largest cloud service providers, the ones most people would be familiar with, this isn't necessarily an issue, although we do want them to be accountable and maintain a high degree of security in their operations. But for smaller cloud service providers that run smaller margins and have less to invest in security of their services, we want to make sure that they're secure because we know a lot of state and local, tribal, and territorial governments are turning to them. There's been a few incidents in the past few years where a compromised cloud security provider or managed service provider has, and the centralization of risk means that a number of their clients have been compromised. So how can we try to head that off if we're looking to incentivize and expand their uptake? So we look at under the National Cybersecurity Certification Labeling Authority, if it exists, or under the Department of Homeland Security with the Department of Commerce, the creation of a cloud security certification, likely using an existing standard or series of standards that cloud security providers could attest to or certify against. And then the requirement of within 5 years, the government looking at that as a potential, including that under FedRAMP or having that security certification requirement as a requirement for government procurement and acquisition. What we see this doing is this moving the market. Now we know that a lot of major cloud service providers would likely already be certified under this. But for some of the smaller providers, they would under this they would be able to attest to or certify to a government recognized certification standard, and make sure that their operations are effectively secured as well, at least to the government's standard. As far as COVID goes. We know that when it comes to remote work, digitization of services and modernization, a move to cloud services can provide a lot of benefits. So I think this works in two ways. The cloud certifications really reinforce this point in two ways. One, amidst COVID, states and state, local, tribal, and territorial governments and small and medium-sized businesses moving to cloud services or otherwise modernizing their infrastructure can introduce flexibility and a level of resilience that is helpful during something like a COVID pandemic, allowing their employees more secure and better access to their enterprise, allowing them flexibility in the critical services that they provide and efficiency in some of the critical services that they provide. Although we know that a transition to this may take months or years. Secondly, we also recognize the fact that as more businesses may be reliant on services like this, it's more important than ever to make sure that they're effectively secured, or at least the owner or operator of cloud of those particular services are taking their security operations seriously. So I'd say amidst COVID, it emphasizes those two recommendations and especially how they need to work together to make sure that we can have modernization, flexibility, and efficiency, but not skimp on the security aspect.
Hey, thanks, John. I'll give you a moment to relax here. I'll switch here to Corey now, the leader of our director for our integration cell. And Corey, up front, yeah, I know you're on my staff. I know all my questions are great. You don't need to tell me as soon as you start to answer it. We'll just go straight into the answer here. So, U.S. federal data privacy legislation has been a hot topic since the EU implemented GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. But we in the U.S. don't typically view privacy in the same vein as we do security. How did the commission come down on its recommendations on a federal data privacy and data security law? And what were some of the key components that the commission identified as necessary in federal privacy and data security bills?
Sure. So as I'll begin by just framing things a bit. So as a recommendation here sort of articulates the value of data in today's economy continues to increase. Data is valuable, whether or not you're in a pandemic or just normal operations. Its value is then driving the rapid development of methods, tools, technologies to capture more data, make sense of it, and then put that knowledge to work. This market or these market and industry realities are then overlaid with a feeling from most Americans that they're losing control of their personal data. Furthermore, they lack the confidence that the government agencies or businesses collecting their data can do anything to improve the situation. This is complicated even further because the US lacks a single comprehensive federal law that regulates the collection, retention, and use of personal information. Instead, what the federal government has done is approach this by industry or sectors of the marketplace, and then with specific types of sensitive information, examples in healthcare and finance. This approach produces overlapping, often contradictory protections just within the federal framework. State laws then add to this patchwork, particularly with respect to data breaches. And then there are the various international standards, as Mark, your question brought up, such as those in Europe and Japan. Absent congressional leadership in this area, these dynamics, they threaten to splinter the digital economy, confuse efforts to secure consumers' personal data, and imperil the ability of American companies to compete globally. So the status quo needs to change, which is why the commission recommended Congress do two things. One, pass a national data security and privacy protection law, and two, pass a national breach notification law. And I'll talk about those, the thinking on which and what we're trying to accomplish in both separately. But regarding the national data security and privacy proposal, we wanted to do 5 things. One, establish the minimum common standards for the collection, retention, analysis, and third-party sharing of personal data. 2, clear definition of personal data. 3, clearly designate what covered entities would be. 4, establish timelines for deleting, correcting, transferring personal data upon request. And then 5, clearly give enforcement responsibility with civil penalties to the FTC, the Federal Trade Commission. There are many ways that you can go about accomplishing these things, and the Commission's aware of many proposals currently pending within the Congress, particularly the proposals from Senators Wicker, Cantwell, and Moran, respectively, the chairman, ranking member, and the subcommittee chair for the Consumer Protection Subcommittee of the Senate Committee on Commerce. Each have introduced legislation that deal with this space in a very comprehensive manner. The Commission encourages a consensus to quickly be reached here. That said, as legislation is solidified, note the distinction between data security and data privacy. Both share a common goal, the protection of individual data, yet they have different approaches for achieving this goal. Data security focuses on protecting data from theft and breaches, unauthorized access to data, essentially. while privacy focuses on how data is collected, shaped, and used, or shared and used, essentially authorized use of data. The Commission suggests that as Congress began working towards a consensus in this area, that they first prioritize data security, because data can never be private if it's not first secure. Now, transitioning a little bit over to the data breach notification. In this space, the states and territories have done tremendous work over the last 15 years. California was the first to pass a state data law notification requirement in 2003. Since then, all 50 states, all the US territories have passed a similar law. And while there are common themes, they vary different in terms of their requirement and their application. So the commission came down very clear, and the commissioners felt that there needed to be one federal standard on what constitutes a breach, and that this standard needed to exempt the 54 state and territorial laws. Mark, that's really all I have. I turn it back over to you and look forward to addressing any questions that come up here.
Thanks. I'm going to go ahead and start picking out some questions, because there's ones that are tied to comments I think would be timely here. So if I could, I'm going to combine two for John here on the certification and labeling authority. The first is from David. It's about what would the relationship be between the labeling authority proposal and the work of CMMC AB sponsored by the Department of Defense. That's the first question from David. And the second was from Colin, and it had to do with how would the NICLA, or how the Certification Labeling Authority, how would the entity be selected to run that program? It would be similar to an RFP. Any ideas what agency would lead that selection effort? So two-part question to you, John.
Yep, excellent. And David, it's great to see that you're on, and happy that you're engaged in asking questions. So for the CMMC, the CMMC dropped in the middle of our work, although we were obviously aware that it was going on beforehand. This, as far as like the CMMC is concerned, the CMMC is a standard for enterprise, certainly a standard for enterprise security and a certification in its own right. But that's one that's granted by the Department of Defense. I don't know if we necessarily see them working together as such. I think that's something that I think the relationship between them is going to have to be something that the DoD and the NICLA works out themselves. I think what we don't want is we don't want overlapping, burdensome standards and certifications. But when we also recognize that when it comes to procurement and acquisition, we see what the NICLA is doing. The audience for that, I think in general, is for the consumer space and the industrial space, not necessarily in government procurement and in government or a business enterprise as a customer of the government, or the government as a customer of a particular business. So I think I could see areas where they would intersect, in that one company may be required to certify under a CMMC standards, and if it produces a product for general consumer use or for industrial use, could electively select to certify one of their products. So I see some intersection there, but in general, they're trying to get at very different things. But obviously, no one wants burdensome certification regimes on anybody. I would also sort of underscore the fact that NICLA is voluntary, and CMMC I know is technically voluntary to the extent that someone's provides something to the U.S. government, but they also have to make money. As far as how this would be selected, we did envision something like a request for proposal, and it would be the Department of Commerce and the Department of Homeland Security. I think in the rec, I think outlines broad requirements for who would be eligible to apply under this RFP. In the legislation, we get down a little bit deeper into what we would require. It would have to be a nonprofit, and it would have to have a clear track record of doing similar work of generating certifications around security, around technology security standards. So we want someone who has been doing this and has a good track record of doing similar work in the past. And it would be best if they were a nonprofit as well and didn't have a financial interest or made money off of, designate themselves as a certifying agent for a particular product and then make money off of that designation. That's something I think we'd also like to try to avoid. So hope that answers your guys' questions. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, John. And next, another pair of questions. This one for Rob on the Bureau of Cyber Statistics from David. Can we, with the commission, and here, I mean, I think he means the authority, because obviously our commission will have no operational role, but would the authority established by the NICLA that the commission's recommending be able to compel industry to produce data as necessary? So would the authority be able to compel industry to produce data as necessary? Second question related to it is, how does this work with the CISA admin subpoena authority request? Would this be duplicative, or is the CISA admin subpoena authority looking at something slightly different? Then the third question comes from Alan, and it's a good one for Rob to talk about, and that's why do we choose to make the BCS an independent agency rather than house the statistical work at an existing cybersecurity agency like NIST? And can you expand on the data exchange component you briefly mentioned for BCS? So that's a mouthful of stuff, Rob. I'll pass it over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Mark. So on the first question, David, where you're asking about the BCS and compelling data. So as written, the Bureau would be able to conduct surveys, which would be voluntary. This is very similar to the way that Bureau of Labor Statistics, for example, conducts surveys and collects data on the labor market from companies. But in the recommendation, we also talk about the Bureau exploring a reporting requirement, which would allow the Bureau to request aggregated data. So think sort of something like the Verizon data breach incident report from entities that collect this relevant data as part of their normal business. We're not trying to create a new sort of another burdensome reporting requirement, but we do think it's important that some of that private sector data gets into the Bureau. In addition, as I mentioned earlier, we would envision the Bureau having a pot of money that it could use to go out and buy proprietary data from entities. On the question of the BCS as an independent agency versus sort of putting it in NIST, so we spoke with NIST at length on this one, and their general consensus, or their general point, was that they didn't really want it. They were looking, we're looking for data analysts to form the sort of workforce of the BCS, not necessarily standards people. NIST does amazing work, but it has a lot on its plate already, and it's arguably under-resourced, which gets into another recommendation that basically in this pillar that we say, we need to fund NIST to do its work better and more robustly. We just don't really view the statistical analysis and the sort of monitoring and evaluation of programs and effectiveness necessarily as NIST's role. And it's important to underscore that the BCS actually, and I misspoke, it's not an independent agency in its own right. It would be housed under an existing department or agency, just like the Bureau of Labor Statistics or Economic Analysis. In the recommendation, we say under the Department of Commerce or another relevant department or agency. The final piece, and I think someone asked about this, was the exchange program that I alluded to, and basically that I touched on it already. But what we envision is the Bureau would be empowered and possibly funded to run essentially fellowship programs where you see folks from the private sector, from academia, cycle in for a year, for 6 months, for however long. And that allows them to really sink their teeth into the data that the Bureau has, work with the Bureau's data analysts, and then take insights that they've derived and sort of publish them for the community, bring them back out and apply them in their day-to-day work.
Yeah, let me take one. Dave, I know you asked about the CISA subpoena authority. So we don't see this as running counter to the CISA subpoena authority at all. I mean, one provision that we definitely have in BCS is BCS would, departments and agencies would be required to provide data to the Bureau of Cyber Statistics. There's a similar provision in a lot of federal statistic agencies. And I can't underscore this enough, is that raw data that statistic agencies get is layers upon layers of protection in its ability to be used besides what that statistical agency is comfortable with. So they'd be able to compel aggregated minimized data from whatever CISA gets from its subpoena authority. So we see that in any type of data like that being collected by a federal department or agency as eventually funneling up into BCS for analysis.
Thanks, John. I'm going to stick with you. Dave had a good question here. That's very germane. There seems to be a lot of ways for the software liability section to go wrong. I would limit it to just the software liability section. There's lots of ways our recommendations go wrong if they're not properly applied. So I agree with you completely. And his question is, how's the software community responded to it? So first talk about how it could go wrong or what we do to try to mitigate that, and then what we've seen from the software community. That's a great question.
No, that's a great, and Rob, I may pull you in on a part of this because I know you spent a lot of time not only writing a recommendation but also the legislation. But look, there's a number of ways something like this could go wrong, and we're very much aware of that. I think from a general level, we wanted to make sure this was a litigation and court-centric recommendation rather than a regulation-centric recommendation. There was an earlier version of this where the FTC would establish a regulatory regime for vulnerability, but that got very, very Byzantine, very, very burdensome, very, very quickly. So we pulled back into something that created a private right of action for damages, recognizing that even just proving damages from a known vulnerability is difficult to do. So that provides a hurdle, I think, for a plaintiff to get across and to have a hearing in court. But what it really does here is it allows a general counsel for a business to, I think, appropriately assess risk. For instance, if they say to themselves that creating a patch for a particular issue would be extremely difficult, if they see that the likelihood of damages resulting from exploitation of a vulnerability is low, and the damages are low, and the likelihood of exploitation is low, is extremely low, then they can make a determination about whether it's in their interest, financially and legally, whether to issue a patch. Now, the vast majority of companies are going to issue a patch. We know that that's likely going to happen, but we want to make sure that a company is in the best position, I think, to assess their own legal risk. But we do, and the other thing is where it could have gone wrong, and I think where it could go wrong is in the interpretation of the standard or duty of care. I think we bandied about what would be a reasonable time frame. I think we landed on 90 days, which for some of the worst vulnerabilities, that is too late. But again, we were trying to look at what is the bare minimum here. If there is a known vulnerability, what could we expect a reasonable time frame? And we landed on 90 days. I know 7 days, 10 days, 30 days may be appropriate depending upon the severity of the vulnerability, but we wanted to sort of create a minimum standard there. I think the way it could go, the other ways it could go wrong is we wanted to make sure, and we did this in sort of crafting the legislation, we wanted to make sure that we properly balanced the ability of a plaintiff to bring a suit. There's a hurdle for damages, but we didn't want that bar to be too low. Another thing that we sort of instituted here was having a certificate of merit. So, for instance, a plaintiff would have to go to a qualified expert who could, in an affidavit, claim that the known vulnerability they're discussing is actually was material in the cyber incident that resulted in the damages. So that would be another bar. We didn't want to make sure, we want to make sure that bar wasn't too low, obviously. Rob, do you got anything else to add on this one?
No, I think that's really good, John. I would just say two things, and it's really just underscoring 2 points that John made. First, on the 90-day threshold, that is based on Google Project Zero findings. So that's not just a shot in the dark. We sort of looked into some of the best practices here and said, okay, this seems to make the most sense. And the second piece there is that we're not talking about patching itself, because again, that is the duty of the end user. We are talking about making a patch available. If a final goods assembler has made a patch available, we say you have met the duty of care. And this cuts both ways, therefore, right? So if you're meeting the duty of care, then you are not liable and you can get suits thrown out quite easily. You get sort of a positive reinforcement from the government. If you're not, then that's when you open yourself up to potential risk. But to John's point, the idea here is not to sort of be punitive or be paternalistic about it and say, hey, the FTC is going to come in and if you've left a vulnerability open for more than 90 days, they're going to come in and fine you. No, damages need to be incurred. They need to meet a certain threshold. And then there needs to be motivation by the damaged party to then come and sue you. We think this is sort of a more elegant and a little bit less forceful and potentially punitive way of encouraging final goods assemblers to sort of make that calculated risk decision.
Yeah. And then the final piece is we also say we don't want to try to change business models. That's the other two sort of things is we don't require that it's a remote update, because that would change business model in a lot of cases. That patch just needs to be made publicly available. Finally, you asked a question on how the software industry has responded to it. Certainly with interest. I think we've gotten a mixed bag. I think a lot of the larger companies have said, there's not a problem here. There's not a problem here. You're trying to fix a problem that doesn't exist. I think we'd respectfully disagree. A lot of the smaller companies, some of the hardware ICS companies don't always comply with the standard of care. At least one does not exist. I know the FTC recognizes one, but has been, I think, inconsistent in its enforcement of its understanding of a duty of care under existing Federal Trade Commission Act. I think we really want to sort of underscore that. But smaller companies, I think are concerned, and I think it's not an invalid concern that this would create a burden for them, and it would. I mean, in some circumstances, but I think understanding a duty of care for what we can expect from software and hardware developers and manufacturers is what we were trying to get at here, and I think the recommendation is successful in doing that, and also kicking it over to the company to determine their own financial and legal risk and when and where it makes sense to do so.
Thanks, John. I'm going to got a couple here for Corey. I'll put them together. One's a question, one's a comment that I'd like Corey to comment on. First is from Matt. How do you see the NIST privacy framework fitting in with your recommendations on privacy? The second from David, is a comment, if you could give your thoughts on it. The California Consumer Privacy Act, in effect since this past January, will help this situation, and your thoughts on both those.
Okay. So I'll start with just the framework and kind of the relationship between essentially federal and state law and sort of how that's playing out. Any federal legislation is going to have to at least address, and all of them, the three primary proposals that are out there right now, in different ways, do the relationship between federal law and state law. And the big sticking point is particularly preemption and whether or not that's how that plays out. And then that specifically relates to, and this gets into the NIST framework, possible solutions or middle ground, which go into the enforcement areas. And there are three sort of primary mechanisms for enforcing. We've been talking about one, which is a private right of action. There's two, a federal entity, which our recommendation makes clear that we need, the FTC needs the authority to enforce any proposal with civil penalties. And then the third is really the state attorney generals. And each of those are going to have their own interests and equities and how they view, what is important to their communities or to them as individuals. And I would say, in this particular, our recommendation really came down and said the FTC needs to be the primary enforcement mechanism. And we recognize, the commissioners recognize the challenge that would have. It's vastly increasing the responsibility for this particular entity. And if you left that as the primary enforcement mechanism, you would need to be able to increase the bandwidth or the resources that particular federal resource or federal entity would have. And of the proposals right now that are pending, there's been a good way to do that. One, to immediately give them the ability to expand the human capital that they have. And then also to be able within a year to come back to Congress and tell them what they would need for the long term. And then I would go to sort of the third part of this, which is any framework in this space really needs, we talk about future proofing, which needs to be balanced against the certainty that we need to give to our businesses for them to be able to compete globally and even just successfully here within the United States. And that really boils down to a in-depth conversation on the rulemaking ability that you would give to the FTC in this conversation. And that's something that I think is going to have to be ferreted out. We've said that very clearly that they need some rulemaking capability and able to provide the flexibility to enforce this. That's all I have, Mark. Back over to you.
Thanks. So we have another question on Bureau of Cyber Statistics from Alan. Have you thought about appropriation amounts that would be required to fund the agency and found it or establish it, and then adequately fund it to buy, compile data sets? You might want to comment there on how we're going to get the data sets as well. And do you believe other agencies should be required to provide data to the BCS? And I assume by that it's other federal, maybe state agencies. So either John or Rob, go ahead and tackle that.
I'll take that if we have talked about appropriation amounts. I think I don't want to lock us into a number, but while we were crafting it, we looked at the funding for, I think, similar departments and agencies in scope, and not counting upfront startup costs, which are different. We looked at an operating budget of about 50 to 70 million a year, which we think would provide the adequate number of full-time employees. And do we believe other agencies should be required to provide data to BCS? For federal agencies, absolutely. This is a similar authority you see in other statistical agencies, but they would the may and shall provision under law is actually really useful. The BCS may ask, and they may request, and departments agencies shall provide. So that's how it's going to be looked at. So they will be required to provide data to the BCS, which we think is entirely reasonable. As far as state and local agencies, I think we have a provision where they can request this data from state and local, tribal and territorial agencies, but we didn't want to go so far as to require, for a variety of reasons. I think if we could have a reasonable certainty, like we have for law enforcement, every state, local, tribal, and territorial government is at a certain level of maturity and understanding and getting a lot of this data from small and medium-sized businesses and their own business enterprises. I think we'd be happy to have that provision in there. But I think what it would do, if we had that in there, what it would do is I think it would cause a lot of confusion and a lot of additional resources burned for not that much. The juice wouldn't be worth the squeeze for the resources we spend on trying to get data from state agencies who may not be in a position to have it. They just haven't gotten there yet. So I think given that, we wanted to pull back. Rob, do you have anything to add?
Honestly, no, I think that's hitting the nail on the head.
Well, Rob, you'll take this next one then. Two questions. One, and this is about the final goods assemblers. Does this include hardware vulnerabilities? And then that's from Dave. And then the second one from Michael is a longer question. Would you identify, and if so, how a distinction, explain how a distinction exists under the existing practice of vendors' toleration of embedded inadequate security, thus requiring mitigation? So that's the one. And the pursuit of a trustworthy vendor or product. Does trust define the scope of due diligence? So probably take that first and then the hardware industry second.
Yeah. So on Michael's question, so trust is not defined in the scope of due diligence. We don't set out to define that. What we are calling for is a duty of care that's focused squarely again on the mitigation of known vulnerabilities. I'm not 100% sure I actually entirely understand the thrust of the question, Michael. So if you can drop more about what you're trying to get at there in, I'll try to answer it, but I'll pivot to Dave's question on hardware. And yes, as written in the recommendation, hardware is covered now. That said, we recognize that creating a workaround or a patch for hardware vulnerabilities is significantly more complicated in some cases than some software vulnerabilities. And in drafting the law, we have basically we've taken that into account and drawn back a little bit in the law on the hardware side of things.
Thanks. One I missed from the beginning, and you may have answered this in your questions, John. If you had, then just tell me, or Rob. But how does the notion of final goods assemblers deal with the issue of open source software, and in particular, operation system distribution variations, such as Linux? Why don't you go ahead, Rob, and take a whack at that?
Yeah, sure. So this is a great question, and I think it's also relevant to touch here on the end of life date, which I think Dave, you brought that up as well. So in drafting this, and particularly in the legislation, we have a carve out here in products, and that's basically that no covered product should not include any product that is created without a mechanism for monetization, which covers the sort of open source aspect, or a product that has exceeded its stated end of life date and is no longer actively supported for other purposes. And those other purposes mean sort of bug fixes and usability updates. So as long as a company or a final goods assembler is providing updates for their product, for usability, for bug fixes, we want them to be doing the same for security fixes. John, anything to add there?
No, I think we were. This is. I mean, Dave's question on like how this could go wrong. This is a good point. We don't want open source software creators to be sued. We didn't want to have a chilling effect on a lot of these programs. And I'll say this on like, the 90-day, like is 90-day cyber time, is that too long? Yeah, it is for the majority of vulnerabilities. Now, granted, you got like Heartbleed, which is a distant edge case. And I think the courts would recognize that. That would certainly be a positive defense against saying that they didn't meet their standard of care. But that is a long time in. But we looked at it and we said, what is the minimum that we could expect here? After 438 days of known vulnerabilities, the average lifetime of a known vulnerability being being a patch not available for it being like 438 days, that's not great. That's what we're trying to fix, and we think that's why we think this standard of care is very, very, very reasonable. But the legal interest and business interest of a company to provide a patch ahead of that date as a service to their clients, their customers, and their product base is still there. Those market forces are still there and still exist. So in many cases, they will meet and exceed this standard of care by miles.
Thanks, John. And I'll take the final question and then wrap us. It was from Mike. It's what's the status of the CSE drafted legislation related to the proposals discussed today? These were some of the last ones finished. It had to do with the timing of the National Defense Authorization Act and how we prioritized our internal legislative proposal development. Also the complexity of some of these and the legal issues involved in them. So they're just now being provided to the appropriate legislative, the appropriate committees in the House and Senate and executive branch where appropriate to. So these are these ones, those are our primary customers from the NDAA in terms of legislation. So they'll be dealing with them or looking at them and deciding to what degree they like or dislike or want to edit, want to throw out portions of the recommendations. And then we'll start thinking with our 4 commissioners who are legislators about how we move forward with them. What's the right vehicle for accomplishment? And in some cases, there's existing legislation that's extremely close. When you think about the CISA administrative subpoena, our version was very close to the Senate version, and the Senate and House versions are actually very close to each other. So I think there's real opportunity on some of these. So the short answer is they're just now getting in, and they are among the last of our legislative proposals to go in because of their complexity and their the method through which we intend to accomplish them. Okay, that was our final. That was the final question on this. I appreciate John, Corey, and Rob supporting us on this. We're going to give John and Rob a break. They've done the last 2. Next week is Val Cofield and her team will talk to us. I think it's going to be Wednesday, May 13th, strengthening norms and non-military tools. Look forward to that and discussing some of the things, both domestic and international on norms and some of the reorganization of the government that we foresee in that area. I want to thank everyone for their questions. In the end, there was 40 questions, which was quite a bit. Some of the questions were good comments, and John and Rob and Corey are all going to try to privately answer a bunch of them, and we'll pick a bunch of them up as well, and the rest we verbally answered. So thank you all very much. Diane, I'll kick it back to you, and we can terminate the transmission.
Perfect. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. And for all of your great questions, please visit our website at www.solarium.gov to view and share this event moving forward. So we hope to see you at the next event.
Hey, Diane, one final thing. I know we get to a lot of questions. If anybody wants to follow up with me or Rob after this and talk through some of the issues that you see with some of the recommendations or provide feedback, hit us up. And same thing with Corey. Hit us up at john@solarium.gov, Corey@solarium.gov, or Robert@solarium.gov. We will take a meeting. We will have a conversation with you. We definitely want to get into it, and we definitely want to hear what you have to say. So please don't hesitate to reach out. Both Daves, I'm looking at you guys, so I'll expect an email soon. Thanks.
Yeah, and I'll put their email addresses in the page for when the video is posted later. So you'll be able to contact all the panelists. Thank you, everyone.